make the lagging. Hopefully we won't have any lags. But putting this out to the group, this is a weird thing. This is also the time if anyone has any announcements. Are there any cool Halloween activities on campus or anything for the good of the group? I've been told about a couple things. I don't want to say them because I'm hoping students want to give the shout out about them. But go ahead. I don't see any.
ATMS.
Does anyone have any cool Halloween announcements or activities to participate in and advertise for the group? I'm seeing something in the chat says UCM reads costumes. Does anyone want to explain it more on that point? Go ahead. I see some hands. Turn your microphone on and tell us more, please. There's a book club event, it looks like. So we got one option. Christian, I see a hand.
Hi, Professor. This is Christian. So my club is actually putting on a haunted house that's free for everyone. And it's going to be like a 3-part event. So there's going to be like small vendors that are going to be selling their items. And we're also going to have like a little like carnival games and also a haunted house as well. So it's all going to be free. So if you guys are interested, it is going to be Halloween night from 6 to 11. And it's going to be in the Cat Quad / California room. So basically like right in front of the lake next to the DC, the dining center. Yeah, but it's Thursday night, Halloween night from 6 to 11.
No pressure. I actually heard about this event through the grapevine and was hoping you would speak on it because I heard we had some cool students who were involved in it. So if you have any flyer materials or anything that I could check out, I might make an appearance. But at minimum, I want people to have the details. So send them my way and I'll post them to our CAT courses. And we'll also make sure we do a little advertising in class on Thursday. Excellent. Yeah, definitely come out, guys. This kind of stuff. Hopefully we can make this a thing again in the post-COVID world, safely, of course, but I love Halloween. All right. Well, I think we're going to jump into content unless there's any other announcements for the good of the group. All righty, we're gonna do a screen share. Now go ahead and let me know in the chat if anything starts acting funny because we are screen sharing. I don't know if that'll end up being hard on it, just like video, but we're gonna hopefully get through it together. And if not, I will switch to my phone. We'll figure something out. So yeah, keep me posted in the chat. Make sure I can see it. All righty. So today we are going to essentially get the content under our belt for this really important topic that is, I would say, constantly learning more. It's ironic, though, that it's not a new problem, and it is arguably one of the first tangible outcomes of settler colonialism in a very negative way. That also means, though, that it has a history that goes back to the first contact, the first invasion, and in present day, some could even say that the situation as it stands is a system by design, that the great number of Indigenous people, and particularly women, girls, and Two-Spirit relatives who go missing in present day are simply a byproduct of a system designed to take their lives so that the land can someday be entirely in the settlers' hands. That as our life givers, they are the link between our communities and the land. And so they have had a target ×3 on their back since contact. And so I like to give people the kind of present day knowledge to work with, but also it's very easy when people bring up the word settler colonialism, just have their like eyes glaze over. It's a big word. We in this class have a little more literacy with it than the average bear. But to me, you have to start the story there. It's not just that people are getting murdered. It's not just that they go missing. It's that the extreme likelihood of those scenarios is a colonial byproduct, not simply a amalgamation of personal choices or even structural, community conditions. It's all of that and then some. Um, Obviously, I've shared in the past that this is an issue I work on personally. It's how I spend most of my research time these days and probably for the foreseeable future. And it's also something that really came home personally. I had worked on the project for 2 years with my tribe. As you'll see in the background, this Taki Skoyi Sa'a Newachek. I will see you again in a good way. This is the logo for the Yurok Tribe's Missing and Murdered Project. We started it in 2019 and it was formally funded until uh, June 2022. And it was a 3-year project where we established the scope and severity of missing and murdered in the Northern California area, loosely defined as kind of the Bay and Sacramento North. And I'd been working on that project for 2 years already when my dear friend from growing up and just even a couple years before, when I was writing my dissertation, Emily Rissling went missing after some mental health concerns and just a confluence of circumstances that was something I had learned a lot about, but came home in a very personal way that is constantly a source of grief, but also deep teachings that help me do this work better. So I'm taking today as a chance to let you guys know more about a topic that's close to my mind and my heart for lots of reasons. It's also officially the first day of our experiences unit. This is the last substantive unit of the class. You're not rid of me yet, but we will spend the next several weeks until the conclusion of the course learning about how essentially the place and the meaning, how these things come together to shape experiences in the communities we've been working with for the semester. Now, in some ways, I designed the syllabus to kind of give us some flexibility Halloween week. And while this is a heavy topic, we're going to do the meat today. The potatoes will come next time. And as I've said, this is the months Emily went missing. So 3 years this month. Halloween's hands down my favorite time of the year. So it really sucks that this will always be a time where we honor her, but I hope that someday that will not be the case because we'll find her and we'll have a chance to honor her in that way. And it'll be a different anniversary. But yeah, Halloween, I'm dead inside for lots of reasons, but I also want to take the chance to have some rest and some play. So on Thursday, we'll get to play and honor her in a good way. And I would love to see questions, comments. I do understand, though, this is often a new topic for people. So if I just get going and I don't see it, find a way to flag me down. If it's just me talking to myself in my car for the next little bit, that's also understandable. As long as you guys can hear me and the recording can hear me. But what was the last big intro remark I wanted to add is that that's it. A big important part of today, so it's our experiences unit, and why in some ways it also makes sense though is that last week we learned about gender. We learned about how gender is it's not this class the only one you're learning about the kind of spectrum of experiences that are vastly beyond the binary of kind of Western society and real patriarchal notions. But we also learned about how two-spirit peoples and kind of the gender binary and the importance of a third gender or people who could occupy a non-binary or liminal place, how important they were for our communities and our ceremonies, our spirituality at large. And that was the case for our two-spirit relatives. But then this larger consideration of gender and how association with the feminine is things that are automatically denigrated by Western society, that anything that is female is less than. That is a going back to Adam and Eve distinction that permeates all of kind of the heteropatriarchal underpinnings of Western civilization. And when we say that, heteropatriarchal just means the default setting is straight white male. And because our societies were not a less than scenario, because our women walked as equals, because they had the power and the sexual autonomy to choose their way in this world, it was for that reason a target was put on their back. And the more Western society learned that it was our life givers that we honored as the tie to the land that we honored, it was even further cause for their demise. And those are harsh words, but they're not true. If you knew that the federal government was sterilizing forcibly without their knowledge or consent Native American women as recently as the 1970s, you would appreciate then that this is a tradition that goes back since contact, and it goes back on paper in really, really obscene ways. And in present day, we see it in this extreme lack of, or excuse me, this extreme violence, and then in turn, lack of justice when cases are piling up without any conclusions. I'm gonna sit, catch my breath. Somebody tell me in the chat, are these things coming through? Are we hearing it? Give me some yeahs, I'm hoping. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you guys for indulging me. Now, let's see here. I'm going to touch on some high points from the readings, but also this is a play-by-play from arguably the preeminent scholar on the subject. So I don't like tooting my own horn. It'll never be a nice thing to say, this is a job I never wanted. It'll be a job I can't ever turn my back on, but to have to be an expert in this subject is something that makes me sick in my tummy, even on the good days. But it's also older than me, and it's hard because it's so far removed from the average American's experience. They often are hearing about it the first time when they hear from presenters like me. On the converse, in our communities, as you've just learned from my experience, and you'll probably learn from others, this is often something we know all too well. And we know someone on a missing persons flyer. We are one or two people removed at best. And we've grown up our whole lives hearing stories at minimum. And at worst, we know what could happen to us if we're not always trying to prevent that from happening. And to say that prevention is key and that it's a constant effort is not an understatement either. Now this is set within, like I said, a settler colonial context where women are being targeted for being women. That is what makes this feminicide versus just femicide. If we think of homicide technically as being the killing of man, we use that to refer to like everybody, right? So femicide would actually be if we were talking about just like maybe more women dying. Let's say there was a reason that was not on purpose to their womanhood. Maybe you just had a society where there were more women, so therefore more women are gonna die. I don't really know a situation where that would happen, but mathematically you can see the logic following. Feminicide, key difference, that in and that I, they add the specification that the focal point, the motive for the violence is actually targeting their very essence as women and as life givers. And this isn't something that's just happening with Indigenous peoples. It is arguably part of rape culture at large, the way women are targeted for their very nature. We see it being a especially pernicious factor to the epidemic, though, because it was our women that were targeted first. And so in a society where women for breathing are targeted, where people with vaginas are targeted for having said genitalia, this world is if we target women on that basis, we're only going to further target women whose femininity has meaning beyond their role as life givers, which is enormous already. But because of the importance of women in our communities, both in ceremonial roles, in leadership roles, as I said, as equals, as partners in the building of our worlds and the living of life, that was a reason for them to be harmed, especially if you get in the mind of the Christopher Columbus and the you're reading the very first accounts of colonialism. They are descriptions of rape, of conquest, meaning essentially rape. Conquest meant conquest of the land. It meant conquest of bodies. And rape was almost what a terrible thing to have to say. Rape was a for sure. Death was a probably. Now you could probably say the same thing, but that breaking of the spirit, the violation that goes with that. I probably should have gave a content warning to this whole class now that I'm saying these words, but also this whole class needs one. When let's see, I'm seeing a chat here. Boom. I really appreciate this point in the chat that this is why I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or do anything when I was younger, or why I'm cautious even today. Try not to go anywhere without my husband. That's like, you don't realize how much you live your life this way till someone points it out. And I think that for me, that's why play is often how I honor my loved ones who've been lost to this epidemic, because young women of any community should be able to go out at night and have a party, have fun, and not fear that their choices, whether it's their attire, their company, or their substance behaviors, that any of these things are going to result in victimization in any capacity, let alone rape and possibly murder. And we know that that's not the case for anyone, but that there are certain communities that feel this especially so. And if you can kind of think of the multiple overlapping marginalizations, they can also have a correlating or corresponding violence kind of prevention or increasing factor in your probability to experience certain things. And that does a harm to a spirit when you can't just like live your life and you're always worried about being hunted. But if you were to act as if you weren't hunted, that would open you up to even greater risk. And I've got slides on this later, but it's always a dark thing to have to tell my students, or any other time I drop this statistic, that as an American Indian woman, I am just as likely to die from homicide as I am the other two leading causes of death for every other American, which is heart disease and cancer. It's the third leading cause for American Indian women, homicide. And our homicides are especially violent more often than not, and very unlikely to see any sort of justice, whether that be a person charged, convicted, etc. Definitely keep putting in things in the chat. If anyone wants to add to that, I'd give you the chance to speak into the mic, but that's also a big statement. If you want to let it stand, you have that option too. Let me take a drink while you think about it. Can I ask just to the room too, has anyone heard of this? But with the exception of when I brought it up in class, have you guys heard about this in the world? Like, is this something that comes up? Okay, I'm seeing some yes. I can't see your little windows, so you're gonna have to give it in the chat if you've heard of it. Okay, okay. A couple. I like that. I mean, I'd hope that was the case, but I'm also thinking 2 out of 40 people. That's not many. Yeah, see? So okay, yeah, see, if you learn through my classes, I was like, yeah, not that it doesn't count. But my presentation, yeah, if you came to my presentation, I was like, that counts, but also only because I was like, if you learn Wind River, yes, I love that someone brought that up. I would love to address that. Wind River, it's one of those movies. I recommend it, but with big caution. And I've only ever had to watch it once. It's not a good rewatcher. I'm a chronic rewatcher, but that one, I love it lets the audience feel things that are very real for people who are close to this issue. And even though it could be done better, it's hard to do that respectfully or well. And it's the best equivalent we have at such a level. So definitely check that out, but don't just watch it any old time. Set aside time to be present and don't go do, or do something fun after. I don't know which. I might do both. But either way, Wind River's good. But Wind River's going to come back again because it's a little different in California. We don't have, yeah, it's a crying movie. Yeah, it's fucked up, guys. But this is not an easy issue. Um, but we are in California, which is a public law 280 state, which you'll learn more about in just a couple of slides. But back to kind of the readings, or at least some important context to our readings. Oops. When we think about this issue, there are, like I said, there's a historical component. It is as old as the first contact, but it's also very colonial in present day. That we learned earlier in class about the kind of the real destruction of the environment that in many ways is enabled by the kind of settler colonial ideal that the land, right, is not sentient, that we can extract and exploit it at will. It doesn't have agency because it can't reason. It can't, it doesn't have that human faculty component. In many ways, the connection between the land and the feminine is also quite literal in the fact that industry and extractive industries have long been the sites of some real missing and murdered violence. It is hard to prove things because there's no counterfactual. You can't set an experiment, but we can say there has consistently and over time been an association, almost in a radiating capacity, that you'll have things called man camps, whether that's for mining, whether that's for darkly wildfire firefighting increasingly, um, logging, just any kind of really male dominated extractive industries often will have, they'll be far from housing, so they may sponsor or offer housing for the workforce. And usually these are heavily gendered spaces with few, if any, women. And that has been strongly correlated with higher violence, especially sexual violence in the areas radiating outwards from these quote unquote man camps. Now, in later slides, I'm going to use the verbiage MMIP, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples. That's what you see on most banners. Someday, I think we'll see Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives more universally. Well, I wanted to flag the MMIWG2, though, because we always need to hold space for where this movement started. That it is only because of the extreme violence Indigenous bodies face that we are all impacted by this, but the only people impacted more by the settler colonial state in terms of violence on their body than our men and our boys is our women, our girls, and our two-spirits. That they have the added target of being life givers or sacred beings, and that this was all the more reason for their purposeful extermination by all the kind of structures we've been learning about in class. Now, when we think of where this epidemic came out of too, we have to acknowledge that yes, it's as old as colonialism itself. It's actually a global phenomenon. And what we know about in America absolutely has to pay homage to the discussion that began in Canada, but also spans borders. So while it's not Canada, I did want to touch on Alaska. Generally speaking, extractive industries, right? The cluster of MMIW around mining and fracking camps, places like Alaska, where there's a really high male-female ratio. I've always heard, if you want to get a husband, you should go to Alaska because there's like 15 women or 15 men to every woman. But it's also, I've heard the expression that The odds are good, the goods are odd. Figure, once that one hits you, you'll get a chuckle. But for better or for worse, this is also associated with a per capita rate of rape that is 3 times the national average. So if you go to Alaska, be packing something, okay, stay safe, because it's, again, there's no, and when I say counterfactual, that's like a statistical term where there's no universe where there's an Alaska that doesn't have a rape per capita rate 3 times the national average. There's no Alaska where that's not true, nor could we conduct an experiment, which, if we think of these being examples of ways to prove things causally, we can only go so far as the extreme correlation, with a 15 to 1 male-female ratio being correlated to 3 times the increase in rape, excuse me. Now, as we learn, we don't learn in this reading because, I didn't want to kill you guys with too much reading, but this is also something that happens across the border to the south. In Mexico, we have the maquila workers. If you've ever heard stories of young women kind of coming from the surrounding areas around cities to kind of make a go of it for themselves, to start sending money back home. There are jobs in textile mills where they can, make a really good living for themselves. But in many ways, this has been seen as almost a red flag to predators, that they almost seek out these women and target them for violence because of their quote unquote audacity to kind of be living on their own in the city, that they must be open to sexual activity, and if not, then someone will take it, that they have made themselves open to it just by being young women in the city on their own. This is also obviously all within a really larger victim blaming mindset, but this is the nature of settler colonialism, and all really an important backdrop. And this isn't a uniquely American experience by any means. Canada is where a lot of this discussion begins. If we can, I think we might have a video station, but I just watched this really good. I mean, it's hard to say good, but it was a video about the Canada's Highway of Tears. Now, Canada had boarding schools. Canada has other minorities beyond Indigenous peoples. But whereas in America, we see the black-white dynamic being kind of the hub of kind of racial dynamics and discussions, where like we have others discussions, but that is where the historical conversation stems from. In Canada, their real kind of white other divide is actually white First Nations, white Aboriginal, white Native, like they use different words for it, but they did some pretty awful things. Not that America's in any room to talk, but Canada, America, Australia, these are New Zealand to a lesser extent. These are 3 of the major colonial powers that enslaved or otherwise kind of exterminated the local population. Whereas in almost all the other instances, they might have an outpost, they might have a city, they might be an important part of the state or country, but the colonial powers that decided to stay and take the land, that is a different colonial experience, and that's where we see some of this connection between settler colonialism and the violence experienced by certain bodies over others. And so Canada, you see a lot of the people being, shot by police, the racial overrepresentations in jail and violent crime, broadly speaking. This has an Indigenous face. And in the 1980s, I want to say, there was a serial killer named Robert Pickton who was discovered to have been murdering Indigenous sex workers, survival sex workers from Vancouver's Down East District, which is like the downtown, essentially the central city, the Chicago South Side, the inner city, quote unquote, of Vancouver. where because you're seeing a racial dynamic that's white indigenous, the faces there are the local indigenous people. And in many ways, they are almost othered just by being indigenous in the city. There's almost a pushback on indigeneity not being a fit to the city, that they should go back to the reserve where they come from. And so often they would be segregated to this area as well. But in either case, he knew that no one would come looking for them because they were often not living with family or far from family. And this was a part of Vancouver that the police didn't care about either. And so he had a pig farm right outside the city where he would take women and some men and eventually kill them, and by all accounts potentially grind them up into the pork products he made there on site. And what's really messed up is when you read accounts of this, the white people of Canada and Vancouver, broadly speaking, were more in arms and upset that they could have potentially ingested human remains, which, don't get me wrong, terrible, terrible thought. But they were more worried about that than the at least 60 women, if not more, he was alleged to have killed. That really wasn't a concern to them, but the minute it got in their meat, it was. And the Canada's Highway of Tears, if you look and try and find coverage of this, even though there are these extreme epidemics, there's hardly any coverage. And that's a part of this issue at large as well, that we are hurt and the media doesn't care. There's many reasons and explanations to that, but that is the takeaway nonetheless. Um, and what's messed up about the Highway of Tears is that you can drive on this highway and you'll see signs advising women not to hitchhike. That a lot of the women who've experienced violence or gone missing were hitchhiking, and in the process of hitchhiking, they were never seen again, or their bodies were dumped somewhere along the road, probably hurt by a driving passerby who dumps the body after. Um, I was like, what if we had signs that said, "Don't fucking kill our people, guys driving through"? Like, that's a totally different way to put the very same question at hand. But when you put the onus on the hitchhikers or the women who are using drugs and come to be hurt in the course of that evening or that experience, that drug part of their drug use, they are victimized. That is victim blaming. You should not just know that if you hitchhike, you might die. That's not the world I want to live in. But we see communities at a loss, and we see individuals at a loss, kind of to the point made in the chat earlier that it's hard to think of anything other to do than to change your own behavior so that you can stay safe. Because in the absence of that, you are opening yourself to great victimization. Now, the hard stats of this are starting to get a little older, and I hope someday will be updated by my own research with the state of California. I actually have continued my work on missing and murdered to include the California Department of Justice's recent effort as part of Assembly Bill 3099 to look at the scope and severity of MMIP in the state. California is different because we have a different jurisdiction dynamics than you would see in modern portrayals like Wind River, or just that idea that tribal lands are federal lands. That's actually not the case in California. And so I'm going to tell you more about that. But these are numbers based on my previous work with UROC, and we know that no matter what, the data on this topic is like super limited and always has to be taken with a grain of salt, because it's the state records are shit. I'm telling you myself. The police records are terrible. They suffer from many different data concerns. So more than likely, these numbers are underestimates. We would see these numbers go up if we had better data. But at minimum, it's highly likely California's in the top 5 when it comes to missing and murdered, which is kind of, when you see these narratives in the media, they don't really bring California into the discussion. But you should know that more Native Americans live in California than any other state in the nation. We have the largest population. It's because California has a huge population, which means we're only 1% of it, but we have a huge number of California Indians like myself who live here, coupled with hundreds of thousands of Indians from other tribal nations in the country who come to live here. California was one of the big sites for the Indian Relocation Act. Stockton, Modesto, two cities themselves. That's why there's a huge Choctaw community in the Stockton and like Central Valley, because a lot of them came out to work in the shipyards. Now, even still, we see that this is a really regional issue, that if we look at the whole state, in 2021, there was 18 cases. In that year, it was roughly an 18-year or 18-month period. So imagine 2021 plus maybe the couple months before it and the couple months after it. In that time period, I knew 3 of the women who went missing in our state. So it's not just Emily, it's 2 other women I grew up with. One I went to middle school and high school with. She was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She was in recovery during COVID with my brother and would relapse and wind up overdosing or more than likely being poisoned by someone who has done it to others in the community. And he dumped her body on a top of a trash pile with her stuff laid neatly next to her. That death does not get documented as a missing and murdered in state records because it's an accidental death. Mariah Lindgren, I went to school with since kindergarten, was always the tiniest girl, Tinkerbell. We was kind of a nickname for her. So I don't think she ever weighed more than 100 pounds, even when she was an adult. And she'd had a hard life. So she got into things like methamphetamine when we were still in high school. But she had many people who loved her and a very big family, both adopted and blood family. And in January 2021, she was found in a suitcase in Southern Oregon in the town where her birth mother lived. We don't include her in the numbers if you count California jurisdictions, but if you count California Indians that died outside of the state, she would be included. And by all accounts, nothing's ever come to light about that case. And this is the norm more than anything else. This is an issue that, whether I knew people personally or not, was something that is like it's disproportionately impacts the area where I grew up as well. That we have this 18 cases roughly in the California at large, but 60% of those cases actually originated north of that San Francisco border to Oregon, right? San Francisco north to Oregon, and actually mostly within the Humboldt County Sheriff's jurisdiction, which is where I grew up. And if you've ever seen, I highly recommend it. If not, the documentary Murder Mountain on Netflix. It's about Humboldt and what goes on up that way. And there's people who want to say it's overblown, and I can only say that's because the sheriff wishes he hadn't talked on film. He doesn't do that anymore because it's all true, and it's even worse. That one tiny jurisdiction that is super underfunded, and at one point they told us there's only 6 officers patrolling an area the size of some states back east. I went to school in New Hampshire, right? So I knew how big New Hampshire and Vermont were, kind of roughly speaking. And it always blew my mind that I was going to school in a half a state that in that 2-state region was as big as Humboldt and Del Norte County, where I'd grown up. Del Norte's kind of like the Canada to our America, the Oregon to our California. It's the hat to our downstairs. So Humboldt, Del Norte, we kind of go together. And just in the Humboldt part, which is the bigger of the two, the idea that there's only 6 sheriffs at any time was chilling. It was like, why would you guys tell us that? But you also got to know that if something happens, you got to keep yourself safe. Humboldt has many reasons to love it, but it's also some shit happens there. You wouldn't believe it if you hadn't grown up there, or they didn't put it on Netflix. But you can see here that we're seeing murder being how a lot of people, yeah, it is scary. A lot of people are getting murdered. That's why they called it Murder Mountain. We also see a high number of people who are missing and then unknown, which just means they're in our cases and they either went missing or were murdered, but we don't know what happened beyond that, which is like a weird third category you didn't even know could happen until you get into this line of work. Now, most commonly, if you were to ask, like, why is this happening? I try to tell people, and this isn't here in the slide, you got to realize there's like say it's roughly a three-way split, we could say, of who is hurting our people. No matter what, though, and I'll come back to that in a second. No matter what, we're seeing that most commonly it's non-Indians from out of the area who perpetrate murders and abductions of our Native women, girls, and two-spirits, and that not only are we more likely to experience this form of violence, but that the actual murders themselves are 7 times less likely to be solved. Now, you guys got to know, and this is just for everyone in the room to know, by FBI estimates, there are 1,500 active serial killers circulating America right now. That's based on the bodies they find, not because they've got the people. They find bodies and they can study them, but they don't know where they are. They circulate the freeways, the interstates. A lot of them are truck drivers. That's just them's the breaks, pun intended. And why that's important is because these guys are out there everywhere, and cold cases, if you were killed in the 1960s, let's go back in time, Leave It to Beaver. You guys don't even know who the fuck that is. But back then there was a guy, let's say 50s, 60s, Leave It to Beaver. In those times, if you were killed, the local police department, the clearance rate, which meant the likelihood that they would close the case, they'd know who did it. Maybe they don't convict them, but they know who did it and they try to convict them. Like, the case is closed. 90% chance that if you were murdered, 90% chance they'd find out who did it by the end of it. You should know that all of us now in present day, if that same thing were to happen, have a 60% chance of that case being closed. There's a 40% chance that if you were killed today, they would never fucking know who did it or why or what or anything. And that is because we have a cold case crisis in America at large, which is ironic given the simultaneous extreme investment in policing across that same time period to see such a grievous kind of reduction in clearance rates. But in a context where we're seeing these extreme these cases going unsolved, it's going to mean that those for whom cases are already more likely, they're going to have even more of a chance of their cases not being solved. And so these numbers, though, we have to take with a grain of salt, because we're still crunching hopefully better data, but I do think this all still stands. Now, these numbers that I'm about to show you pivot to our men and boys, because it's not just our women and girls who are experiencing violence. And it's important for me to say that suicide is actually one of the leading causes of our men and boys, that it's actually the leading cause of American Indian men 17 to 24, and the risk of suicide continues to outpace nearly every other group over the life course. They also experience multiple health disparities, including high death rates from both chronic and accidental causes. They're 2 times more likely than the non-American Indian population to die from homicide. And according to the CDC, they are actually the most likely to die from police violence. Now, I bring this to bear because when we preface the stories of our female-bodied relatives, it's not to exclude our male-bodied relatives. It is instead in a real acknowledgement that the only people who stand next to us are the others in our community because of settler colonialism and the violence we've always experienced. And actually, what is particularly grievous for us is that if we think of who's killing our people and why this is happening, the ways police can interact or be effective are directly stymied by the fact that we have Indian women, Native women, excuse me. When I get worked up, I'm saying Indian. We've got our women who don't call the police for help when they're getting hurt because they're afraid that their children could be taken by the state. They're afraid their husband or partner could be killed by the police, or worse, they're afraid they could be taken for defending themselves. And so all of these things together are not helping at minimum, but they're also, our men are sick. They do everything they can to protect us, but they aren't well either, and they experience violence alongside ourselves. Now, in many ways, who is doing this? Let me see what else we have here. I've touched on some of this already, and I want to prioritize our time today. Starting to run out of steam too. So I touched on some of this. Jurisdiction's a big part of this. I don't want to get you guys too into the weeds, but you got to realize, so the whole feds coming in and the FBI investigates, that happens in 40 of the 50 states, give or take. In the 1950s, there was this thing called the termination era, where the federal government was just doing another thing to be against natives. And they were trying to essentially say, oh, you guys are you're doing well now. Now we don't have to pay you, or we'll just cut you loose. And we don't owe you nothing no more. And one of the ways they did that formally was to give essentially 10 states that had the most natives at the time. They were like, you know what? We cede jurisdiction to the state. As part of Public Law 280, they gave the states nothing to enforce jurisdiction on formerly federal lands. And so states then were tasked with having to police areas that they were never given resources to police, that have unique experiences that require their own policing resources at minimum, but also it's still federal land in a taxation sense. So they don't actually get money from the property on that in those tribal lands. And so there was a simultaneous like ceding of jurisdiction without any infrastructure. And most states really just handled that by not, end of sentence. They just didn't do anything. And so these areas became lawless in a different way to the federal lawlessness we see, where the feds are far away. And so jurisdiction is different because we also don't have jurisdiction over tribal members on federal lands, no matter who you are. That is a whole course, let alone a whole, and I mean like an entire semester course, not a day's course. But in present day, we're trying to build those tools now, and we have at times like states and county people who are receptive, but there's also people who aren't. There's a lack of trust that goes both ways. And so there's a real need to cultivate buy-in and restore relationships. And so a lot of the work I'm doing is geared with a mind towards doing that. And in all candor, I am recording, I just remembered. I work with a lot of police, and I never thought that would be like that. And I can't always be the way I want to be or say what I want to say. I have to play a longer game and hope to God they're not lying this time, because at present, the only people who can keep us safe are law enforcement officials, because we've decided to take mental health and a whole host of other community conditions and only treat them through the police state. And so right now, the police are who we have to work with. Long term, we would hope that we'd have other institutional partners that are working towards, prevention, because by the time we're talking to the police, it's too late. But I could just get going on that one. But like I said, I want to keep it brief, at least as we bring it to a close, because we have more to talk to. And what I want to do, and we'll have some questions, maybe some prompts, but we're going to do some just discussion and Q&A. You guys have the chance to talk to the preeminent scholar on some dark shit. Let's fuck it up on Halloween. Excuse my language. But so this is just a map we made to explain jurisdiction and how incredibly complicated it is. And while I'm not going to go through all the bunny hops right now, you can see that, yeah, is there any evidence they were kidnapped or trafficked across state lines? If it's a yes, boom, it's federal, easy peasy. But in California, if the answer is no, then you go on this maze across all the other potential jurisdictions it could be responsible for, and the very small chance that it could wind back up in the feds' hands. Now, this is a public law 280 climate. Other states have this. It can also, because reservations are a hodgepodge of different kinds of land outside of California, in California, both included because of the Allotment Act and other circumstances. There is always a question about jurisdiction, it seems. Ironically, when they were kicking our teeth in during the fish wars, there was no arguments about what police could kick in whose teeth. But when it comes to a woman being hurt on a land that has the hyper surveillance of maybe 5 to 7 fucking police agencies, all of a sudden it's not our job, it's not our jurisdiction. That's a very interesting rub, one could say. Now this is a point I made earlier, so I'm not going to belabor it, but let's give the police some due that in some ways this is a police force problem. The reason why they have open cases and cold cases is because most police departments are actually smaller than 25 officers or less. And so on any given day, they're really spread thin with like the ongoing demands of calls for service in real time. And so that is taking precedence, unfortunately, in if you only have so many hours and so many things to do, there's cases that get farther and farther behind. Now, there are ways that we can try and intervene, and this is where we hope to take the conversation next time. The National Day of Awareness, that's actually what I presented for last year or earlier this year, and we will next year as well. This is observed on May 5th. Ultimately, though, and I like to leave people with the fact that, like, we need to have this conversation before someone's taken. Like, we should be building the resources, we should be building the protocols, having the relationships built. Because you don't want to be doing it when you're getting the call for service. That and also, how does that feel from a family perspective to know that the other person in the line doesn't know what the fuck to do either? That doesn't feel good. And why is it just our families that have that constantly, we drop the ball and we wish we could have done better? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've heard an officer apologize for dropping the ball. It doesn't really matter because it's always us who are dropped. That starts to be a bigger problem than just any one person or any one system, right? And that's because this, to bring it all back, this is a larger conversation that Take Back the Night, if you're familiar with that's something we shouldn't even have to need a world where like we're going to take back the night so women don't have to worry about getting raped on the way home. But that's the world we live in. And we all have, no matter what genitals we have, we all have a responsibility in ending that. But the roles look different, the experiences look different. And so I always try to bring it back to also the teachings that we have uniquely to offer as Indigenous peoples. And like I said, it's because we were targeted that we see this system by design as it is in present day. But it is also our power that maybe if we restore these teachings, we can keep ourselves safe, and maybe there's lessons for the larger culture about the importance and the sacred nature of the divine feminine and the balance and the duality of genders together. That is a larger social conversation and change that is arguably even more important than the very real, like, cold case investigations, cold case inventories, real practical things that we could suggest. Now, we are going to close here. Next time when we come together, we're going to talk about this issue a little, but I am going to share a trailer from this cool video that talks about the flower dance from my part of the world. I'm hoping we can get it to play. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. This is where I grew up.
I sent a snap to our whole group chat and was like, guess who started her period? It's like, wait, this means that I'm gonna have my flower dance this year.
Okay. My fingers. You're blinded for 4 days. And then we remove your top.
You're right in the center.
And you're reborn as a woman.
When they asked us, well, what was your flower dance like? And then you're like, well, I didn't have one. And then it's like, well, why? But just like everything we do, right? We put good thoughts into that food.
That dance floor is your world. Don't be afraid of anything that comes out there. We all got you.
So now you're coming in as girl and you come out of boy. Now that's what we do. We've perfected that process.
All right, Lindsay, well, I love you. You're gonna do great, okay?
Okay. Love you.
Okay, see you in the morning.
See you.
Now, why I always like to share that, besides I love bragging on home, is that in many cases, you know, we're right now at a really important point in establishing the scope and severity of this crisis. And it kills me every October to know that it didn't matter what we did, because my friend is still gone. And now all I can hope is someday to find something to put in the ground so that her kids can visit it and I can visit it. That's not a universe or timeline I thought I'd be living in, but it wasn't a timeline I wasn't living in. I just didn't clue into it. And while it's hard work, it's also no greater service for my degree to use it in this way. And I do believe it is because of who I am and the people I come from that I find myself in this position. And I'm going to work the rest of my days so that things like Emily don't happen again to someone, because inevitably we know we are still at risk in the time being. But I have to believe that maybe in some ways we will have a world where this won't be the reality, because this didn't stand on the necks of the women who came before me. While it has been for the generations since, there was a time where it wasn't like that. And our teachings, our dances are the tie we have to those times. I believe it is the tie we will have to find our way back to them as well. And so missing and murdered is a topic that is just, it brings a lot of threads together. And so we're going to keep the conversation going. Next time, I'm going to pause here for questions, but we're going to say we're formally done with content. We're at 1:12. You only got a couple minutes back, but we're going to be together on Thursday. Please plan on doing it's a really good content week. So no matter what, listen to the podcast and things like that. But if you don't want to take the quiz, dress up. I'll be dressed up and we'll be vibing together for Halloween. Bring questions, comments, considerations for the topic, and I'll see you guys then. Yeah. We'll stop the screen share. I'm gonna stop